Hey, good afternoon. This is another privacy chat. I'm Nick Merker. I'm the chair of Ice Miller's Data Security and Privacy Practice. I'm an attorney based in Indianapolis, Indiana. And this is Privacy Chat, like I said. And today we'll be talking about big data. And the purpose for talking about big data today is I had a request yesterday from someone who was asking about the Edward Snowden quote that I mentioned in the last Privacy Chat. And in particular, I'll have it on the next slide, but I was thinking about how this current situation is creating some new opportunities for surveillance, as Snowden is talking about, but also for big data conclusions to be made, or for people to use big data to assist in this pandemic. And so, with that, I kind of thought about as people rush to do things, to react to things, we find ourselves walking into privacy or security mistakes sometimes. We saw that with IoT as people rush to get devices into the market that were connected to the network when they've never created that thing before, and they ran into problems. So I'm going to talk about just some common things. Again, if you want to contact me, I'm Nick at icemiller.com, or you can find me at nmerker at any of the channels on the right here: Twitch, Instagram, YouTube, Twitter, or Facebook. So the Edward Snowden quote, there's a link here that you can go to. But the Edward Snowden quote that kind of got the question that I had was, he said, when we see emergency measures pass, particularly today, they tend to be sticky. Emergency gets things expanded, government rights expand, and it's hard to get the government to take those rights away, take those new things away, is essentially what he's saying. And that was in an interview he did just a few days ago. And so that's what kind of got us starting on this big data track today. So I'm going to be mostly talking about some big data case studies from the Obama Office of the President from May 2016. They had a good report on big data on algorithmic systems, civil rights issues, and I'm going to be talking about some of the case studies they brought up and how big data conclusions can have a disparate impact on certain parts of the population that maybe the folks who designed those concepts wouldn't have thought about. And then I'm also going to be citing to a Chicago Kent Law Review article that kind of was a great summary of some of the concepts I was discussing here. So you'll see those links in the upper left. There's a link there to the Obama White House document where I'm going to talk about here in a minute. So the document talks about how in the 1990s, so this isn't anything new, and in the 1990s, the way that you applied for a job is the exact same way you apply for a job today, except without the internet. You sent in your cover letter, you sent in your resume, and it went to an actual person on the other end who reviewed every single one of these by hand. And that person decided whether you should get an interview or not. At the time, because newspapers and kind of job postings were not online, I would imagine the number of applications that came into jobs were a lot smaller than they are today. Today, we can just blast out 100 different applications to 100 different jobs if that's what you want to do. Whereas this, back in the day, in the 90s, it was more difficult. Well, with the proliferation of the internet and the ease of people applying, and the desire for companies, of course, to save money, folks figured out that, hey, we could continue having an individual review every single resume, or we could replace that individual with a computer. At least replace the first layer of review of someone's resume and cover letter with a computer. This makes complete sense. This is how, I mean, if you apply for a job today, this is how it works. You send in your resume on Indeed or some other website, or maybe even the company's website directly. There's almost no company I know of a large size that's going to review every single resume that comes in via hand. I just don't know of people that engage in that practice anymore because it's just so time consuming. And the reason for that is people can go online, they can draft one cover letter, they can draft one resume, and can just fire it off to a million different jobs. And so we've replaced that at least tier one review with a computer. Well, what are some issues with that? I mean, traditionally, if you had the face-to-face reviews of someone, this is a quote directly from this Obama White House document. If you had that face-to-face interview with someone, there's this unconscious phenomenon called like me bias, where I want to hire someone that is like me. I want to hire someone that when they're in the office, they're going to think like me, they're going to look like me, they're going to act like me. That's that unconscious like me bias. Well, we can have that as you replace the human with a computer. You can have that same like me bias, and it can come in a variety of ways, and ways that folks really don't think about. I mean, if you have a goal as a company to remove a human from the element in order to improve your diverse hiring strategies, then you may actually be walking into non-diverse hiring strategies, because that algorithm that you're using, that computer you're replacing the human with, is relying on imperfect data, or it's making flawed judgment and assumptions, and it's just perpetuating the biases that you're trying to remove. Um, and so let's talk about how that could happen. The first, and this is now, I'm kind of quoting from Matthew Bruckner here, an article from the Chicago Kent Law Review from 2018. There's a link there where you can go read this. It's a very good read, and some of the not case studies, but some of the examples I'm about to talk through, I pulled from his um, Law Review article, which I thought was very good. The first way that you can walk into this unconscious like me bias is that you train your algorithm with bad data. Meaning that if you have a 50 years of hiring practices, and you want to take all of those 50 years of hiring practices, which were based on an individual doing the hiring and having that unconscious like me bias, and you take all the traits and skills and other attributes associated with people you hired in the past, and you just throw that into your new algorithm to teach your new algorithm how it should hire people, it's just going to perpetuate the same biases that you had before, whether you know it or not. So an example of that, and this is from the Law Review article, he said that there was a British hospital, St. George's, created an algorithm to help decide which students they should admit for medical training. And it was a learning algorithm, like I just talked about. So what they did is they took a data set derived from some of the school's past admission decisions, and they threw that into the algorithm. But what they didn't realize is that their past admission decisions had been systematically unfavorable to equally qualified racial minorities and women. And so, because they used those past admission decisions and threw them into the training algorithm to have future admission decisions, they just perpetuated the bias that they were trying to avoid. Um, so, if you train your algorithm with bad data, you're going to get bad data on the other end of it. Another way that you can walk into this like me bias without realizing it is that you pick bad criteria, or so-called programming bias. So the folks have to design, at least today, folks have to create the algorithms that you're going to use in order to hire people. And so let's talk about some of these different criteria that could be used, and how they might be proxies for race, or proxies for age, or proxies for sex, and it's implicit in the or proxies for wealth, implicit in the criteria that you don't really pick it out unless you really think about it further. So let's take length of time since last job. If you're using, let's say, a hiring company wants to use the time that someone has been in their last job. They're trying to avoid someone who switches job every 6 months. And we see that common in the market. Someone will be at a job for a year, then they'll go to another job, then will wait a year, go to another job. You're trying to not hire that person. So you look at the length of time since last job, or the length of time that someone is at a job. And this could have a disparate impact on the people that you're going to hire, based off of folks that are having difficulty getting back into the workforce now just have an increased difficulty of getting back into the workforce, because you are using this as a criteria to screen candidates. Another example, more clear on kind of the unconscious criteria that I mentioned, is commuting distance. If your factory or your company is located in a very affluent area, and you use commuting distance to the office as a way to pick out who you want to hire and who you don't want to hire. If your office is in a very affluent area and the surrounding suburbs are very low income areas, then someone who has a higher commuting distance is actually someone that's going to be a lower income person, more likely, than someone who has a less commuting distance, because you're the proximity you are to that affluent area. And this is a real example that I pulled from this Chicago Kent Law Review article. The example he cited was that it was a kind of a manual labor job, where they found that this job satisfaction was tied to, this is by interviewing their employees, job satisfaction was tied to your commuting distance. So you have to commute. I mean, it's kind of obvious. If you have to commute 2 hours every day to get to your job, you're probably going to be less happy than someone that commutes 2 minutes to their job. However, that commuting distance can be a proxy for wealth, and it also can be a proxy for race or religion, or if commuting a longer distance gets you to a different area that has folks in it, then you might walk into this unconscious bias without realizing it. You can also have unreasonable criteria. You have programmers sitting in a room or data scientists sitting in a room trying to figure out what makes a good employee here. And so you may choose things that are completely unrelated to the job and start screening off people in ways that don't make sense, like credit worthiness when someone isn't actually going to be handling money, or criminal records when that really isn't a criteria that matters for the job. Or then this one I want to focus on in particular, and it's the age of interest in a particular skill. And so I'm going to pull up an actual quote from his article, or his law review article, and he says that if you use the age of a candidate, and let's say you use computing compared to their peers. So you want someone who's been thinking about computers since they were in fifth grade. You want someone who's always been interested in computers. They have 10 years of just interest in computers. Well, if you take that approach, you're going to find that you may be associating with finding more men into as acceptable applicants instead of women, because of as it says here, men compared to their peers, cultural messages and assumptions that associate computing with boys more often than with girls. You could promote environments where more boys than girls are exposed to computers at an earlier age, thereby skewing later hiring patterns towards male hires, even though your company's hiring goals are not associated with that. So age of interest in a particular skill, computing, seems like a pretty reasonable criteria if you just think about it on its face. But when you kind of get behind it just one level, you can see it actually could be a proxy for sex without you realizing it. And another example they had from his law review article is that sometimes you get results that just don't make any sense. And he cites to a study, it's a 2012 study, so it's not a new study, but he was talking about a Google AdWords study from Professor Latanya Sweeney, and she found that algorithms powering Google's AdWords system were expressing racial bias. They were associating black identifying names with suggestions that a person had been arrested more than it did with white identifying names. And this was true regardless whether the company placing the ad revealed an arrest record associated with the name at all. And so her analysis found that it was 25% more likely that the algorithm would suggest someone with a black identifying surname to have a potential criminal than someone with a white identifying surname in this Google AdWords study. And she couldn't figure out why. She did this study and just said this is a 25% increased clip on this identification for this particular for this particular set of people, and I can't tell you why. I have no idea. This is something where this isn't programmers sitting in a room thinking about these things and thinking about the concerns as they're developing. This is now you have your big data strategy or algorithm in place and assessing it to see, are we unknowingly creating some sort of like me bias or unconscious bias on this on groups of people that we're just not we weren't predicting it, we weren't aware of it, but now that we do assessment, it goes, oh wow, this is happening and we need to change what we're doing. And I thought those three issues are all really interesting and shows how big data mistakes can occur. There's another example. This is going back to the Obama White House big data white paper, and they were talking about how credit scores are what the market has traditionally used to determine whether you should get credit or not. However, credit scores have a ton of problems with it, and then the biggest problem is if you have a crappy credit score or you have little to no credit, how do you get credit? If I am 24 years old, I want to buy a house, but I've never had a credit card, I've never paid a utility bill. How am I going to get this house? I have to. So the kind of the prevailing wisdom when I was growing up, at least, is you need to open up a credit card and you need to get an increased limit on it. And you need to show that you're someone who can pay off a credit card and you have this long history of credit, just so you can later on use it for something. And that doesn't really seem to make a lot of sense, but that's how the lending industry worked for a long time. And so there are major displacers to this industry who are coming and saying, well, we don't need to do any of that. We can come up with new criteria to try to determine whether someone has creditworthiness. We're not going to use utility bills. We might look at that a little bit. We're going to use other criteria that might help out to determine whether someone's going to pay their bill off or not. And so So again, if you have little or no credit, how do you get credit? Well, duh, use this new criteria. But what criteria do you use? And this Obama White House talks about some criteria that maybe you shouldn't use, like social media connections, GPS location information, or shopping patterns. So social media connections, if you are on social media, and this is something that lending companies have actually considered, and that's why they're writing about it. And this isn't just me making this up. If you as a lending company or you want to use social media connections, see, okay, who is Nick Merker connected to on Facebook, on Twitter? Who does he interact with? And so I want to pull all of his social media connections, and I want to see, do those folks that he's connected with, do they pay their bills on time? Do they have loans and pay off their loans and on a fair, according to the terms? Um, well, if you actually take that approach, you are just really perpetuating the underserved in credit. The whole purpose of identifying kind of this new system is to get away from credit scores. But if you use social media connections, you might just be perpetuating the issue. Because if I am someone who is connected to a bunch of folks who are underrepresented in the lending industry, then I'm probably not going to get a loan myself if you use this criteria. Similarly, GPS location information has basically the same issue. If you are in a low income housing area and you're using the people in my area that also you're looking at their credit history, then you're going to make a poor conclusion because you're associating me with folks that live near me who are also in a low income housing area. So you're making a conclusion, and actually they've gone one step further in these studies to show that that type of GPS location information can really be just a proxy for race, and so you're having a disparate impact based on race in that category. And then there was an example from, this is going back to, I think, the Law Review article on shopping patterns. Um, where did I have it? Oh, yeah, here it is here. So on shopping patterns, American Express lowered a customer's credit limit from $10,800 to $3,800, not based on his payment history with the company, but because other customers who have used their card at establishments where this person recently shopped had a poor repayment history, and so they changed their credit associated with that event. And the law review article is talking about how this really could just be a proxy for sex, a proxy for race, or a proxy for some cultural item associated with where people shop. So, for example, if I am, let's say I'm a video gamer, I'm broadcasting on Twitch here, and you lower my credit history because I shopped at GameStop. And other people who shop at GameStop also don't pay their credit card on time. You're actually just kind of having a disparate impact on people that shop at GameStop when that really shouldn't be related to this activity. And if you kind of take that kind of ridiculous example and translate it to people shopping at areas you would go to shop for. Maybe it's a certain type of grocery store or a place where you can purchase religious items. You're now creating a proxy for culture or religion in a way that you really probably didn't think about when you're doing this analysis. Um, so it's just, and here's an example on the screen about the social media connections creating questions about this issue. So it's just a really kind of interesting area where big data has a lot of power in trying to make conclusions about folks and give you better information or more automated decisions based on information available to you. But the reality is you could walk into proxies of race or sex or age in ways that maybe you didn't think about when you were designing the system. And the reason I want to talk about this, one, is I had, again, someone who was asking about it yesterday with the Edward Snowden article. But two is that companies are doing this constantly, not doing the practices I just mentioned, but coming up with big data concepts constantly. We know this in the privacy space. I've advised a lot of clients on big data issues and what disclosures you have to make and the exact concerns I just mentioned. This is from a CNBC article where data scientists is, according to them, the number 3 job in the United States in 2020. And there's 6,500 jobs. This is from January, not today. And the median base salary is over $100,000. So this is a very data scientist, a person that would do these exact types of big data conclusions, is a very hot job. And although the examples I had from before were with employee and with lending, this is happening in really every company that you interact with. This is from Google's privacy statement. Google says, hey, we're going to use the information that we collect from all of our services, all of our Google products for the following purposes. And they list them out here. And one is to provide personalized services, including content and ads. Well, how do you think they do that? They're doing that by taking all of the information that they have about you, putting it into a portfolio or profile of you, and trying to make guesses about what you want to see next based on your previous browsing history or your previous activity with Google products, and also what other people like you, based on their determinations, are also interested in. So this is something that's happening all the time, and it's not. This isn't new. I mean, that Obama article that I mentioned was from 2016, and then the law review article was from 2018. But this has been going on for probably even before then. And so companies are trying to engage you in new ways and trying to use big data concepts to assume what you're going to do and interact with you with a way that is more likely to get you to interact with their brand. And of course, in the lending space, in the employment space, we're trying to automate kind of what once was a human element in order to figure out how to make these more efficient. So this is just something I thought would be interesting for this little privacy chat today to talk about big data. Again, if you want to chat with me, I am at nmerker at any of the platforms on the right here, or you can email me at nick@icemiller.com. And thank you very much for tuning in to Privacy Chat today.